it is so quick from like, we broke this boundary to, I don't know if I can trust him when he says he's going to do this. I don't know if I can trust him when he says that this is his priority, or this is where he is, or this is where he's going in life. And I think we sometimes hope that those transgressions, breaking boundaries, will just stay in one area of our relationship. Like, yeah, we struggle with boundaries, but man, the emotional and spiritual impact that it has when we don't keep those promises we made to each other, those agreements to honor each other in certain ways, can be huge. Welcome back to the Thrive College podcast. I am so excited about this episode, not only for the topic that we're covering, because it is one of the most requested conversations that we have in Thrive College, but also because we have my favorite human being in the studio with us today. It is just the two of us, my partner in crime, my partner in life, and we run Thrive College together, the one and only Cheyne Dena. I give it up for him. Woo, 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 woo. That's my applause. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So glad. Yeah, that would be really awkward if you were like, this is the worst thing on my today. Yeah. So, okay. As we're launching in, you are all things take care of the staff at Thrive College. You definitely manage the budget. I'm not allowed to do that. But tell us, a question we've been asking is, tell us your middle school celebrity crush. I don't know this, to be honest. And I can't believe we've never talked about this, because it says a lot about people.
It does. Weirdly enough, there was two names that came to mind, and if I had to like pick between them, I don't know if I could. I want to say it was either Avril Lavigne or Hillary Duff.
Okay, those are actually very anti-types. Yes. So that is really crazy.
Couldn't decide which direction I wanted to veer.
I love that so much. Did you watch the Lizzie McGuire show?
No, couldn't stand it.
Well, how did you have a crush on her then? Was it her movies? What about her?
No, I just think I saw her and thought she was great.
Okay.
But the show was terrible. I couldn't get through an episode.
Okay, that's perfect. I absolutely loved it.
I don't think I listened to Avril Lavigne either.
Okay. Well, all right. So you're very image-based is what I'm finding out.
I think that was accurate.
Nothing about her personality, nothing about who she was. Okay. All right. Well, we'll work on that in our relationship. So, all right.
It was beyond what they did. It was who they were.
I don't think so.
Really
for you. Yeah. I know. I'm thinking that's not the case for you. So thanks for sharing that. We'll work through that with the counselor later. But what we're going to be talking about today, so you and I, at our relationships intensive that we do every year in Thrive College, we do I think it works out to be like a 3.5 hour session when all is said and done. We definitely break it up on boundaries. And hands down, there are so many fun moments on the intensive. We can't share the details. You have to come to Thrive College to figure that out. There are so many transformative, just like Jesus grabs a hold of students' hearts and transforms them moments. But when we're asking students like, hey, what was the most pivotal thing that you learned? Like, what are you walking out of here and know, like, I'll never forget this. I will use this in the future. Usually it's actually around this topic of boundaries. So for someone who's just like, wow, okay, what is that concept as it applies to a romantic relationship? How would you define what a boundary is?
Yeah. First, I think we should say, you briefly mentioned, but when we talk about this for 3.5 hours, that is spread over several days and several sessions.
Yeah.
You come to Thrive College.
We're not that great of speakers that people can just listen to us
for 3.5 hours straight. No, it's definitely broken up over several sessions. But boundaries, yeah, it's such an important topic. And I think in terms of relationship, the reason it resonates with people so much is because it's not just an aspirational, idealistic goal. It's something that is very practical. It's I could do this starting tomorrow in my relationships in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And so the way we tend to define boundaries is it's just a limit that you place on something. It's how far will you go? What will you contain? What will you allow yourself to do and to feel and to think? And so in a world that says, go for it, sleep with as many people as you want, do whatever feels right to you. There is no boundary. There is no constraint, really. You should just do what makes you happy. The Christian ethic says that's not right. And by the way, if you do that, you won't be happy.
Right.
That the way to really have a healthy, whole relationship is to have some boundaries. And by the way, the world actually does believe in boundaries once you're married.
Right.
But when you're not married, it's like free for all in a lot of cases is the advice that's given to you. And then if you decide to get married, then you have to somehow
Just
be very contained and flip a switch. And so the Christian ethic is no, be holy and guided by the Christian ethic all through the relationship, and holy and honoring to God in that relationship. And so boundaries are the ways that you place limits or constraints so that you make sure that relationship is holy and God honoring.
That's so good. I feel like when you're starting out exploring the topic of boundaries as limits on what you will and you won't do with your mind, your body, and your soul, right? Because God has made us all three. He's made us mind, body, and soul. So boundaries have to be in all three of those areas. I think when you start exploring the concept of boundaries with people, they're really just familiar with one Christian boundary, right? It's don't have sex. And it's very narrowly defined. It's crystal clear. And people are like, okay, that's the big no when it comes to romantic relationships. But what we have found is that all of the power in this conversation lies in moving beyond that simple boundary. Okay, so if we know the Bible is very clear about that, marriage is supposed to be the one place where you are to enjoy the gift of sex that God has created. But what about everything else? How do you properly manage your emotions in a relationship so that you have a healthy emotional attachment to someone? What does it look like to have a healthy physical attachment to someone? This is where Christianity sometimes tends to go so silent and be truly unhelpful. And that's why we're doing this episode, is we want to be helpful. We are mega fans of romantic relationships. Like, I am just giggly anytime a student tells me that they're in a relationship, which I am always somehow the last to know. But I find it out and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is the best news. Like, this great person with this great person. It's amazing. Give us some insight into why should we press into this awkward topic other than just like trying to avoid having sex? What are some of the benefits of having healthy boundaries?
Totally. And I think one misnomer, like you said, to clear up right off the bat is, think someone listening to this and it's like, it's limits, it's constraints, it's what you won't do. It's really easy to hear that and go, oh, Christians are just all about rules and don't do this and don't do that. And Christians never have any fun and yada, yada, yada. But here's the thing. And this is what I usually tell our students is, anything that we consider to be extremely powerful, we put boundaries on. We put restrictions on. Your car has restrictions on it, right? You can't drive 110 miles through a school zone. It's not safe, right? There's kids about. We put limit in place when there's children around the road so that people drive slower to protect them. We have fireplaces and the grates close so that the fire logs don't fall out. And then we put brick around the fireplace. Those are boundaries to keep the fire from getting out of the fireplace, because when it's in the right place, doing its function, it's enjoyable and awesome. And when it gets out of control, it's dangerous. Same thing with guns, with power plants, with anything that has a lot of power. We put these rules and constraints on it to protect ourselves, to protect other people, and so that we can use the thing for its intended purpose without it getting out of control. And I always put to our students, I say, what is more powerful in your life than romantic relationships?
Yes.
What has more effect over your mood in a given day than how your romantic relationships are going oftentimes?
Right.
They're so powerful.
Yeah.
And so if we go every other thing that's powerful in the world, we put these constraints on, but our romantic relationships, which affect us more than any of those things on a day-to-day basis, why would we not also put rules and restraints on that? And those rules and restraints limit us, but in the end, grant us more freedom to enjoy the thing in front of us. Right?
That's so good.
If you light a fire in your living room, you're not going, man, I just am so glad that this is spreading all around the house everywhere.
Right.
Like, I'm just enjoying these huge flames burning down my house. No, you enjoy it when it's being used for its intended purpose.
Yes.
Right? Same thing with relationships. When they're when they're working as intended in the way that God has created them, in a holy and a God-honoring way, the people involved in that relationship feel more peace. And as you asked, and it was a long way to get here, like, what are the benefits of this? I think the benefits are many, but the clearest one is you're building trust with each other. You feel a peace about your relationships. You don't feel shame in that relationship.
Yeah.
You feel an incredible amount of peace, but also when you make boundaries and stick to them, you're telling the other person that I value you more than maybe what I personally would want in this moment. I honor God, and that when we decide something together, you can trust me. And that kind of trust, day after day, week after week, month after month, builds and can become an incredible relationship, incredible marriage one day. So this is a huge thing with incredible benefits when people do it correctly.
That's so good. I can't tell you how many gals I've sat down with in my office and just loved like the beginning stages of a relationship. It's joy, it's excitement, it's, everyone's rallying around them and hopefully rooting for them. And I can't tell you the heartbreak and the slow heartbreak that happens as they come into my office and say like, hey, we crossed this line. And it may seem like a really, really small line, but it was a boundary that they set. And hey, there is no shame, right? Guilt is a godly thing if it leads us to the feet of Jesus where we can confess it and say, I'm sorry, I repent. Please wash me clean so I can have another chance at this because I value this relationship. But shame, that there's no place. But as they come into my office and say, man, I'm just disappointed because I thought I was in this godly relationship, but we keep doing things that we know are wrong, that we decided we were not going to do. And what inevitably ends up happening, I'm not on the guy's side of those conversations, but I can see like in the girl's eyes that as much as she cares for this person, there's now this huge gap of trust. And it is so quick from like, we broke this boundary to, I don't know if I can trust him when he says he's going to do this. I don't know if I can trust him when he says that this is his priority or this is where he is or this is where he's going in life. And I think we sometimes hope that those transgressions, breaking boundaries, will just stay in one area of our relationship. Like, yeah, we struggle with boundaries, but man, the emotional and spiritual impact that it has when we don't keep those promises we made to each other, those agreements to honor each other in certain ways can be huge. So every time you break a boundary, it's an opportunity to repent and say, man, I not only did I break this boundary, I broke this person's trust. There's work to do to repair this trust. But also every time, because sometimes it doesn't feel good to keep boundaries, right? It literally goes against the way that God has wired us physically to keep boundaries. But when we keep those boundaries and it doesn't feel good, it's an opportunity for us to celebrate. I honored this person. I built trust. And I walked away from a situation that was escalating and leading to a place that I said I wasn't going to take her. But you know what? She can trust that I am who I say I am, and I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. Boundaries build or break trust. I love that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note because it could be easily misinterpreted like, okay, if I'm making boundaries and we break them, that doesn't build trust or it breaks trust, then why should I even have boundaries at all?
Yeah.
And I just would answer that, that even if unspoken, all couples will inevitably have boundaries. They will have things in the relationship that they go, this is okay, this is not okay.
Yeah.
And if it's not in a Christian context, those boundaries might be much wider, and the restraints might be less, but they do still exist.
Yeah.
And so in the Christian context, for those following Jesus, there is an ethic in the Bible, and there is a way that God says this is how relationships work best. Mm-hmm. And we've experienced that and believe that to be true. And so we want to encourage couples, hey, try this. Like, yes, it is hard. Yes, it does mean sacrificing your desires at some point or self-interest at some point for the betterment of the other person and to honor God. But what comes out of that on the other side is an amazingly healthy relationship full of trust and love.
Yeah. And I think, one final thing before we get really, really practical, I just want to say, like, don't underestimate the impact that building this muscle of honoring boundaries, don't underestimate the impact that has on preparing you for your future calling. Right? So the people listening to this podcast, you believe that there is a God and that he has called you to do very important things with your life. Maybe you know what they are. Maybe you're still in the process of figuring it out, but you sense that God has a calling on your life and that calling is important. Well, here's the deal. You are going to be in the future in situations where you are tempted. And there are so many Christians that have fallen because they have not built this muscle of keeping their boundaries. They underestimated the importance of it in their single life or in their dating life. So when they get to their marriage relationship, they fall short in this area. And it's an area where the enemy is so easily able to attack them. I mean, I think about the fact that you and I, like we work with awesome, amazing, godly, attractive college students all the time. And you know what I am not worried about when I pass your office? You meeting with one of those awesome, godly, attractive people. Why? Because I have seen you model this. You have built so much trust with me over the years that I feel like, yeah, that's just not an area that I am worried about. It's not front on my mind. So don't underestimate the impact of building this muscle in terms of preparing for your future calling.
Yeah, that's great.
So getting practical, we love to break down emotional/spiritual boundaries as well as physical boundaries. So let's tackle some really good emotional boundaries. Give me just off the top of your head a few ones.
Yeah, for emotional boundaries, when we mean and emotional boundaries for people listening, that might be a super weird concept that you've never even thought of before. Like,
right.
Why would I need to have boundaries on my emotions?
And is that even possible?
Yeah, is that even possible? Like, doesn't the heart want what the heart wants, and yada, yada, yada? Well, the Bible says that to guard your heart above all else. Mm-hmm. And so we really believe that it is important to guard your heart. And what that means is as you progress in a relationship, there are stages where you should get more emotional, you should get more vulnerable, you should get more real. But in the early stages of a relationship, and I actually think this is the cause of a lot of relationships failing quickly that maybe otherwise wouldn't have, is people get either really, really attached really soon, or they just unload all of their stuff right at the very beginning. Yeah. And the second one, that's almost like a TV cliche. You know, somebody goes on a first date and they say, I love you.
Right.
Like everybody knows you shouldn't do that.
Right.
You know what that is? That's a boundary. The boundary is we don't say I love you on first dates, right? Or the other one is you go on a first date and you know, the person on the other end is just bawling their eyes out. You know, all you were doing was getting to know, you were having coffee, you were getting to know, and they're crying and they're talking about, you know, everything that happened to them when they were 7. And you're like, I was not prepared for this.
Right.
Okay. And those are extreme examples. Those are examples we see in comedy TV shows. But what happens realistically in people's lives is they start sharing a lot of that deep stuff before a foundation of trust has really been established. And when you share that really deep stuff with somebody, it starts to knit your heart toward them. Mm-hmm. And when you start to knit your heart towards somebody in a really deep way, you've started to unguard your heart. And that creates some expectations in the relationship that it's deeper and it's progressed farther than it has already gone. And so a lot of relationships, I think, crumble under the weight of that. Mm-hmm. Really realistic example, I think, is when couples start talking about their engagement or when they're going to get married, like 2 weeks into dating. Right. And it's like, like now there's this unspoken expectation that this relationship is heading towards marriage. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you've had 2 coffees and a dinner. Like you have no idea whether this is going to go to marriage or not, but you've put this super weighty expectation on it, and the relationship doesn't have the infrastructure to support that. And so it begins to crumble. Right. And so I think with that, one of the things we tell students is to guard your time, mm-hmm. in the sense that sometimes we see when people jump into a relationship right away, their entire schedule changes. Right. You know, they stop volunteering in places they start or used to volunteer. They switch around all their schedule. They spend all their time, you know, they wake up and they drive to that person's house. They spend, you know, hours with them after school or work, and their whole entire life changes. Like, that's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. Another one is to guard your thoughts. And this one can seem a little like, why would I need to do that? But it's just, again, it creates unrealistic expectations in your heart if the only thing you're doing is thinking about that person. Right. And so I would encourage people, and that's a natural inclination, I think, especially when you're in that very brand new relationship stage. You get butterflies in your stomach. You know, every song on the radio is about you and them. The good songs, not the breakup songs. And then you just start thinking about them and daydream. And I think a certain amount of that is okay, and it's normal, and it's infatuation. But if it's dominating your thought life, it's not healthy for you. You know, and a lot of this just is about moderation. Mm-hmm. So guard your time, guard your thoughts. And then we say guard your relationship with God. You know, just something to observe about your life if you're a Christ follower listening to this is is God number one still in your thoughts? Are you still seeking him as much as before? Mm-hmm. Is your relationship driving you to pray more, to seek God's counsel more, and to follow him more? Or is the relationship, causing you to walk away from God and to think about him less and to be with him less? So that's just something to be aware of.
That's so good. I mean, even one layer more specific when it comes to guarding your time, talking with your boyfriend or girlfriend and saying, all right, it's the early stages of our relationship. How many nights a week are we going to be hanging out? And then take it one step further and say, on the days that we're hanging out, is this like we're texting all day? We're like chatting each other? I don't even know the social media. Like, I'm so old, right? You're just like, you're not cool, Dena. But in whatever ways you typically would communicate with your significant other, just ask the question, like, what prevents me from engaging with the people that I was hanging out with before? What will prevent me from being a good friend in this season? What will prevent me from being a good daughter, a good sister, a good brother, whatever it is? And just really be honest about that. Like, I remember early on, it was actually in our friendship because we were friends before we started dating. And I was like, hey, I feel like the constant like texting back and forth is not great because it's pulling me away from hanging out with my family. And so you were so great about that. And what did we do? We just started hanging out more. So the time that we were present with each other, we got to be present with each other. But the time when I was physically in the room with someone else, I got to be present with them. So that's a really practical boundary you can set. When are we communicating? And how often are we hanging out?
Yeah. And I think this is even a conversation you could have together or possibly even just with yourself of, Dena, you've had this talk with me about this tends to be, I think, something that women think about, I think, more often than men, is that like kind of jumping immediately to engagement, marriage.
Yeah. Start your Pinterest board.
Are they the one? Yeah. Start the Pinterest board, the wedding board, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And what you've told me, I think, is brilliant, is just like give yourself a season to not do that.
Yeah.
Like let the relationship be as it is before, thinking about the wedding just adds unnecessary stress to the foundation of your relationship.
Yeah.
That's not needed.
And to go after, because there's a group of people listening that you're just like, you're incredibly Christian. You're hyper Christian. Like you've read every single book about being godly in your relationships and you're determined to never sin or mess up in this area of your life. You absolutely will because you're a human and you need Jesus. But there's a segment of us that we're just like, I'm not going to date this person unless I know I'm going to get married to them. Don't put that pressure on your relationship. You do not know yourself well enough, and you do not know the person that you're beginning a dating or courting relationship well enough to have that answered, right? Like unless God literally told you are going to marry this person, and I would definitely double check that by some other people, you do not know, so you do not need that pressure. Don't harass yourself asking the question, is this the person I'm going to marry? Because if not, I need to end this now because my heart's getting tied to them and I don't want to make any mistakes. Whoa. It's hard to be a good girlfriend. It's hard to be a good boyfriend. Give yourself the grace of just saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to be a great boyfriend. I'm going to be a great girlfriend so that if I end up breaking up with this person, then I'm still going to feel like I did right by them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I think on my mind about that is just to the guarding your heart. If you have put all of that weight and pressure on it, I'm only dating this person because I know we're going to get married, and then you break up.
Yeah.
That the level of heartbreak and healing that needs to take place on the other end of that is so much different from somebody who said, I'm going to guard my heart a little bit. We're going to take this slow. We're going to walk out this friendship. And, I'll open myself up as time goes on.
Yeah.
Like that's just very different from that. And then, you have a few dates and go, this is, we're going to be better off as friends or whatever. When you end that relationship, it's not completely heartbreaking and defeating as it is when you go, this is the person I'm going to marry. And then you break up and you feel like you just broke off an engagement.
So true. All right, we're going to transition now to asking the question about physical boundaries. But first, if you've been listening to this podcast and you love the community that you are hearing about and want to join us, Apply to Thrive College at mythrivecollege.com/apply. Cheyne and I have given our lives to developing young leaders. We believe in you and we want to help prepare for your calling. So if you feel God tugging on your heart as you're listening to these episodes saying like, man, I need more of this in my life, more of these type of people pouring into me, helping shape my future, then go to mythrivecollege.com/apply. And we would love to consider you as a student for next year and help you on your journey. So with that, physical boundaries, short of just literally not having sex, what can you do physically to guard yourself?
Yeah, this piece of advice comes from Pastor Kurt Harlow, and I've just always legend have always just loved this advice. He tells us about, when he was dating who is now his wife Kelly, and he would say we would always hang out together in public places, and he said somehow my self-control to keep my clothes on was always very high in the booth at Denny's. Yeah. Like there was never a temptation for me to be without all of my clothes when I was in the booth at Denny's. Right. And I just like, that's so I also have never felt that temptation. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that's just great advice, hanging out and having that conversation about, and Dena, me and you had this conversation about, were we going to hang out alone? Mm-hmm. And if we were going to hang out alone, were we going to, hang out alone in a house? And we kind of modified that over time. Yeah. But when we were dating, we said the answer was no. And then when we got engaged, we were doing long distance and it was really impractical for that to stay true. So we said we could hang out in the house by ourselves, but we couldn't be in a room if no one was home. And then even when we were in a room, the door had to be open. And so, just putting some really practical things in place that aren't even very difficult to upkeep, I think is really, really helpful.
I think also with our boundaries, just sharing from our personal story, and everyone's story is different. Like you might hear our boundaries and be like, nope, not for me. You might hear them and be like, that might work for me. But for us, while we were dating, we decided not to kiss until we were engaged. And then we decided when we were engaged, we could kiss, but if we were home alone together, we couldn't kiss. Now, I remember sharing those boundaries with one of my ministry teammates. And he said that, it was specifically the not kissing while we were dating. And I remember him saying, you are missing the best part of dating. Why would you do that to yourself? It was such an honest conversation. And I just laughed and it was like, man, if this is the person for me, we have an entire future together to get to enjoy that aspect of our relationship. But just to be real, I love what I have with Cheyne. And so I'm willing to go to crazy lengths to not lose that. I love what Craig Groeschel says. He's a pastor and he says, if you want what everyone has, do what everyone does. If you want what few people have, do what few people do. And for us, that was the motivation behind this boundary. Is we were young college age students and we'd seen so many of our ministry teammates just get taken out. And we're like, we don't want that story. We were friends for a couple of years. We knew by the time we started dating, we really want this to work. And so we were willing to go to some pretty extreme lengths to not mess up our relationship with each other in this way.
Yeah. And we're not saying that our boundaries were perfect or that everybody needs to have our set of boundaries. What we're encouraging is that is a conversation between two people. And the conversation is, how do we have a God-honoring relationship? How is this relationship stay above reproach and be something that, we're proud of and that we're not ashamed to talk about? Another question that we asked ourselves about, being alone together and what should our boundaries be and all this kind of stuff, kind of a guiding principle we had is we would never want somebody to walk in and have us be ashamed in any way. Mm-hmm. We said if we were, kissing or whatever, that could be embarrassment or whatever, that kind of silly stuff, that would be okay. But we would never want to be doing something where if somebody came in and caught us, that we were ashamed of what was happening in that moment. Yeah. And so part of that guided the conversation as well.
That's really good. I don't know if you remember this, but the first time you told me that you loved me, it was our 6-month anniversary. And it was such this like sweet, amazing moment. And I kid you not, you said the words, "I love you." I said, "I love you" back. And then like a sitcom, my family barged in and they were like, "Hello, happy anniversary." And they just like ate up this whole entire moment. And it was just like, okay, so basically like moral.
I blocked that out.
Yeah, I was like, of course that happened. That would totally happen because, that's my family. But it was this moment where it was like, okay, well, we're never safe. Like our family's just going to barge in at any moment. So that's good. Any other standout, like you've seen other couples do this in the past that's worked really well for them? We haven't talked about like time done hanging out at all. That's a classic one I see a lot of people doing.
Yes. And again, there's no like, it's not Cinderella's carriage. Like there's no exact time that it was holy and then it's sinful 1 minute later. Mm-hmm. But like the truth is, as it gets later, your inhibitions get lower, your judgment gets impaired as you get tired. Like they've done studies that say like people there's a certain level of sleep deprivation that is essentially drunk driving. Like you really don't make great decisions when you're super tired. And yet a lot of couples, probably because it's more intimate, it's the time they actually get away, like decide that the best time to be romantic with each other and hang out together is like alone at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And so I would just go, again, I don't know the exact time, but you go, is that wise? Like, is that, yes, it's great in the moment, but long-term, is that like what we want on a night-to-night basis that leads to a God-honoring, healthy relationship?
Yeah.
And so what we have found helpful, and again, this can be talked about, this can be modified, whatever, but is for couples to decide, here's when we hang out. Here is you could call it the Cinderella principle. Like, here's when the clock strikes and one of us goes home. Yeah. Or we both go home. But so we're done hanging out at this time. And again, I think that's a trust thing where you build trust with each other, mm-hmm. and an emotional thing where you go, our lives are not entirely shaped around each other. We have our own things. We go back to our own places. We don't spend every waking moment together. But also just for the sake of decision making and yada, yada, like it's good to have an end time.
That's really good. And just as people who've been on the receiving end of a lot of confessions of just being like, I really messed up in this area, not necessarily even having sex, but just other decisions that people have regretted. A crazy amount of them happened at late hours, mm-hmm. and they happened often. This is crazy often, guys. They happen at the end of long ministry days where you used up every ounce of self-control and literal godliness that you had. You used it up in service of the kingdom, and you found yourself at the end of the day just in a really weak spot. And so I think it's no coincidence that David is at the end of a long campaign and battle season where he's just like, one day I'm staying home. I'm done. I'm tapped out. And that's when the tragic incident with Bathsheba happened. So give yourself a moment to go and be with Jesus and rest and regain your willpower and self-control. Use it on the next day.
Absolutely.
So a couple more things as we're wrapping up. First, what would you say to someone who is like, okay, well, Cheyne and Dena are perfect and they have the perfect marriage, and but I've already screwed up this area of my relationship, like emotional boundaries. Had no idea that was a thing. Like, we are already so far gone. Like, we're planning the wedding. Like, we've gone places emotionally we shouldn't have gone. How do you come back from that? And then also, what do you do if you are in a situation where you're like, we're sinning physically in our relationship, and man, I just don't even, I don't know how to get out of it.
Mm-hmm. I think to the thing like, oh man, this is like boundaries and like honoring God in your relationships. Like, that's just for, super Christians or pastors or whatever. I would say for me, that was, and when we met, I had been on the back end of failed attempts at that. And where I had known that I came from a non-Christian background, didn't have examples of healthy relationships, and the relationships that I had been in prior to that point weren't healthy. And so when I was learning about my faith and following Jesus, I had a couple of times where I started relationships and I knew that I probably wasn't in the right place to do those relationships, and heard pretty clearly that I shouldn't have been in those relationships, and they didn't go well. And they did end in some heartbreak and some bad decisions. And so when Dena and I met, I was on the other side of going, man, I just made a bunch of mistakes. But the great news is, one, I think God is a redeeming God, and he forgives our mistakes, but also he grows us through them if we keep seeking him and returning to him, repenting, like all of that stuff. Like, God does not turn away from us. He's the father who runs out to get his children, to rescue them, to hug them, to love them, to guide them. And so if that's you, just know, like, this isn't the story of super, pastors and Christians, the story of people who have made mistakes, but also the story of people who on the other side of those mistakes, God helped to do it right. And so I just preach this from the rooftops of, like, man, doing God-honoring boundaries in your relationship is so worth it. And yes, it's hard, but a lot of the things that are worth it in life are hard. And so definitely something that, like, it can be done. It doesn't take a super Christian. It takes somebody who goes, I'm going to honor God in this. I'm going to treat the other person as even better than myself, as scripture commands to do. And I'm going to be committed to this because I know it is the best thing for the other person. It's the best thing for me and my relationship. And for somebody who, if you're in this and you're like, man, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, like, we're not obeying God in this right now, in this season, I would say my advice would be to talk about it. Like, things that are hidden don't get healed. You got to bring it out to the light. That's how you get rid of shame. Also, you gotta talk about it.
Yeah.
And I would recommend that each of you go talk to somebody separately, somebody that you trust. And then, depending on, it's hard to give just generic advice over the internet, but you might need to take a break for a while to heal. You might just need to put some boundaries in place and some accountability. But I think the biggest thing is always returning to the Lord and saying, we're committed to God. And the amazing thing about God is, when you do it God's way, it ends up being an incredible blessing in your life. And that is definitely what I learned when I did it my own way. Is boundaries were broken, trust was broken, heartache happened. When I did it God's way, I ended up with a relationship that I love and that I feel like has so much trust, and it's just paid dividends for over a decade now of doing that relationship well. And so it can be done, and it is an incredible thing to do.
Yeah, so good. So last question. If you're just in the position of being like, all right, well, what to do next? Let's start with the person who's in a relationship and you want to establish some boundaries. We're not going to lie to you. This is awkward. Like, this is the conversation that you do not want to have, but it's really important to have this conversation together. To that end, we love you guys, and we have created a free tool at mythrivecollege.com/boundaries. It's our boundaries builder. So what you can do is you can actually go to that website and you can see just some awesome godly examples. We've scoured dating books and listened to dating podcasts and talked to so many couples and within Thrive College, seen what works and what doesn't work. And we've just given you lots of options, what we've talked about today, but also many more. You can see examples of emotional boundaries and physical boundaries. And you can literally, through this interactive tool, you can build your own boundaries. And at the end of it, you can download, all right, these are my boundaries that I want. And that could be if you're single for a future relationship, or if you're in a relationship, you can do that. And then you can encourage your significant other to go online to do the same thing. And then you can have what Cheyne and I like to call the boundary state. So early on, I think it was like our third date, we went to sushi. So that's important. Pick somewhere fun and have a boundary state. Let them know what's coming and say, hey, I want to have a conversation where we talk about some emotional and physical boundaries because I love that we're in this relationship. Be careful with that love word. What if you accidentally said, I love you? Again, maybe stay away from the love word. I am so happy that we're in this relationship, and I want to make sure that we continue to honor each other and honor God. So let's have a boundary state. Go to somewhere fun, maybe your favorite coffee shop, maybe your favorite sushi place, and say, hey, here's some examples of physical and emotional boundaries I'd like us to keep, and then compare lists. What do you do, Cheyne, if your lists don't match, right? Like if someone is like completely on a different page than you, how do you have that conversation?
Yeah. Well, the advice I always say is you go with the boundary that's stricter, and that's just honoring of the other person in the relationship. And healthy relationships, that's how they work. It's not 50-50. It's I'm all for you and you're all for me.
Yeah.
And I will lay down my preferences for what's best for you in the relationship and vice versa. And so whoever has the stricter boundary, their conscience is more affected or whatever it is, you would just go with their boundary, and that's the honoring thing to do.
Yeah. Is that Romans 14 that principle is taken out of? So read Romans 14 if you need the Bible to back you up on that one. And this is something that you can evaluate throughout the course of your relationship. Ideally, not after you've broken a boundary, but maybe you're like 3 months in and you just want to revisit like, hey, are these boundaries working for us? Do we need to loosen them or do we need to tighten them? And then last pro tip, share them with a couple people. If you have a really good friend that loves Jesus and loves you, share them with that person and say, hey, would you please ask me how these boundaries are working? And then if you have a small group leader or a spiritual leader in your life, share them and say, do you have any feedback for me, any input? Do you think these are good boundaries? Ask me about them. And that just gives permission for other people to speak into your life. And you really can't see sometimes the red flags in your relationships, but other people that God has surrounded you with, they'll be able to spot them first. So invite other people into the conversation. Any parting thoughts? The wise Cheyne Davidson, who's in love with Avril Lavigne and Hillary Duff, still coming back to that moment early in this podcast.
Full circle. Thinking about that the whole time.
I
I think my final thought would just be that I know this can seem weird. And it seems like so much, and like it's so aggressive, and it's something that if you didn't grow up in the church, and if you're not a Christian, or even if you're newer to the faith, like this could seem so weird because it is not something that exists out in the world. Like there are not people going, hey, you should have all these talks about your boundaries, and you should have boundaries, and you should restrict what you're going to do and when you're going to hang out and who you're going to be with and if you're going to be alone and all that kind of stuff. But I think it comes back to that quote that you shared. Yeah, few people do that. But what most people do is they don't have these conversations. And what most people have is relationships that end in heartbreak, and relationships that end with baggage and broken trust and frustration and all these kinds of things. And, and even the relationships that lead into marriage often begin with broken trust, or you don't even realize there was broken trust until down the line. And so what we're advocating is, yes, it is a little weird, and it is something that few people do. But imagine in a relationship, if what you had was a relationship with somebody where you trusted them and you knew that when they said they were going to do something, that they would do it because they honored you, and that they could feel the same about you because you mutually honored one another in your relationship. And you could be before God just feeling like you're blessed and like you've honored him and he's honored you, and you have just this complete and amazing trust in your relationship moving forward. Like that is what is being offered here. And so, yes, it might be weird, but it's absolutely worth it.
That's so good. And last pro tip, because I don't know, I guess I can't let you have the last word, which is totally rude of me. But I was just thinking about this, like, yes, this is so weird. Everything you're saying is so true, but here's the deal. Once you set a boundary, fully enjoy whatever is inside the boundary, right? Like there was a moment where if he looked at you, you just, oh my gosh, right? If you got to hold her hand, that sent you over the moon. Like if you got to kiss, like that was it for you. There was a moment where it was enough for you. So once you set those boundaries without guilt, without shame, and without like this ever pressing, like, oh, are we going to be, pushing past this? Do I have to always be guarded? Just fully enjoy whatever you are allowed to do. Because here's the deal. I loved dating you. It was so fun. Like I look back and I'm just like, that was a great season of life. It was confusing and chaotic at times. We were long distance for most of it, but it was fun. And I just want that for everyone listening. So as we're closing this podcast, know this: God is a fan of you. He is a fan of the person that you are hoping to date or are dating. He knows them so well. His eyes are on you and he is cheering for you. He wants a world that is good for you. He wants what is best for you. And at the end of the day, we are rooting for you and the romantic relationship that you will be in or that you already are in.